In this video, I'm going to discuss the construction technique for the center front bib and placket on the Folkwear Pattern number 202, the Victorian Shirt. So on the front of the shirt is, as you'll remember, the center front pleat, and the bib gets applied on top of the shirt front, and then the placket on the right side and the left side gets stitched on, and finally the bottom is clean finished with this tab. Let's look at the pattern pieces to remember what that is. So here is the shirt front, and there's the pleat at the bottom. Here is the bib pattern piece that gets applied right there, matching up shoulder, neck, and the front edge. And then this is the placket. This is the placket that gets folded to create the placket that gets stitched here. The pleat gets tucked in, pleated in here, and it all gets clean finished down there with the tab that goes all the way across. You'll remember that the collar comes down like this and is clean finished on the edge here, matching up with the edge of the placket. Be sure to be precise in the patterning, cutting, marking, and then stitching of this placket. We want it to finish at 1.25 inches wide. That's so that the button has a nice amount of placket to sit on, and there's fabric on each side of the button to frame it. So here we have the shirt front, and down here is this extra wide bit that will get pleated up in a later step. And we need to talk about the left and the right plackets. As we are cutting the fabric in a previous step, cut out 2 left plackets and 2 right plackets. Just cut out 2 layers at one time because the fabric is already folded and we're cutting 2 layers at a time. And then this is where we will decide and remember which is left, which is right. Basically, we're going to discover the left, right, inside, outside conundrum in these next couple steps. This is my teaching sample, so you may observe that some things are already clipped or some things are already stitched on. That's because this is what I use in class as a teaching sample, and so just work with me on that during this video. You will notice that the front of the shirt has a notch, and the front one edge of the placket has a notch. That's to help us get the correct placket on the correct side, left and right of the shirt. You'll notice that one placket is a bit longer than the other placket. That's going to help us in a later step. So let's pay attention to those notches here so we can get the placket sewn to the shirt front correctly. To begin, pin the left placket, which is the shorter placket, to the left edge of the front opening on your front, with the right side of the placket against the wrong side of the shirt front. Consult the diagram in the instructions. This is different than we normally do. We normally do right sides together, stitch and turn, but this is how this needs to be for the right side of the fabric to wrap around and create the placket in 2 or 3 steps from now. So pay attention to right side and wrong side and the correct placement of that. Stitch that placket to the shirt front from the neck, from the cut edge to the neck, back stitching here, and down to, the instructions say to the notch. What they really mean is to the corner of the front opening. This is the notch. Once you've stitched and back stitched nicely here, clip to that corner, because we're going to need to turn the fabric to the outside. We want that to be one of our pivot points for the fabric. Next, take the other, the right placket, the longer one, and fold it and stitch across the bottom bagging out that bottom edge. Stitch just to the stitching line here, trim that down to 1/4 of an inch, and turn and press so that you have bagged out, clean finished this bottom edge down here. Next, pin this placket to this side of the front opening, matching the notch, and stitch here from the neck edge, back stitching here at the seam line, stitching down to the notch or to the corner of the opening, stitch down there to the notch, back stitch, and clip that to the corner as well. I'm going to be pinning this on, and imagine this line of pins is the line of stitching that we just talked about. Yeah, that'll work great. Once that is stitched, turn the shirt over. We're looking at the right side of the shirt now. And pull those plackets through those clipped corners to the outside, or the right side rather. We want to iron this seam allowance into the placket, and we want to iron this seam allowance into the placket so that we're providing, or creating two sort of clean finished edges, so that when we fold this over and stitch in a next step, this is what we create. This is where we need to make sure that this is maintaining that 1.25 inch width, because once we finish this side of the placket, we're going to be putting them on top of each other with the button and buttonhole, and so we want them to be the same width. This is the point at which you'll want to trim and grade the seam allowance down to 1/4 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch. We don't want all this bulk inside the placket. It will make it too lumpy. This is also, once you have this seam allowance trimmed down, this is also where you need to determine if you need to put some interfacing in your plackets to offset the color that the seam allowance will make. You see this edge, let's see here, this edge is a folded edge and there is no seam allowance there. So that is going to present as 2 layers of fabric. This edge has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 layers of fabric. Even though it's trimmed and graded down, it's going to have 5 layers of fabric right there. You need to, once you've got that trimmed and graded down, you need to fold this over and determine if the layers of fabric on this side create a shadow. For example, if you have a sheer or a thin ivory or light colored fabric, that might create a shadow on that side, in which case you'll need to cut 1.25 inch by the length of the placket of interfacing, lightly cross stitch it to the outer side, the side that the audience will see, so as to provide a barrier for the shadow created by this seam allowance. So this is a time to test that once you've trimmed the seam allowances down, folded this over to see what that looks like. Before we clean finish the plackets, we need to insert the bib onto each side of the front. So we'll do that next. Press under the outside curved edge of your bib and trim that seam allowance down to 1/4 or 3/8. Here again, you'll need to check to the outside to see what kind of shadow that double thickness makes against the bib front. If you think that it makes enough of a shadow, you'll need to cut without seam allowance some interfacing and cross stitch that on just inside the seam line so that the seam allowance can be blocked and any shadow it wants to create will not come through to the outside. Once you have the seam allowance trimmed down and possibly interfacing lightly cross-stitched inside, then line up the front edge of the bib with the line of the seam line here and very securely straight pin or hand pin and then baste the outer edge of the bib in place. We don't want this to shift in the next step of the top stitching it on because we want this edge to be a beautiful, smooth, clean finished line once you've got it stitched. Once you have the bibs pinned well in place or basted, then fold the plackets over, and remember you've already pressed this and already determined if you need to put interfacing in, and you've trimmed all the seam allowance down so it's much less lumpy than I am presenting at this point. Pin that over with this seam allowance at the bottom of the opening pushed down. So what we're doing is we're going to pin this along that edge and we're getting ready to stitch. Once you have both plackets folded over, pinned in place, again, make sure that you're establishing a true 1 1/4 inch width. We want the seam allowance of the bottom of the opening pushed down, and then what we can do is flip the bottom of your plackets to the inside of the shirt. There we go. So that's to the inside of the shirt. This is pressed down, and what that does is clears the way for you to machine top stitch down both sides of both plackets to set up that really nice top stitching that runs parallel down both sides of the placket, and then the same top stitching down the edge of the bibs. So there it's starting to look like something. Once you have the top stitching in place, take out all the pins. Now it's time to move and lap it correctly, the right side over the left or left side over the right, and then deal with the pleat down here like that. Go ahead and pin that in place. This is where you'll need to figure out if you need to trim or clip, grade, before we go to the next spot, or the next step rather. Because the next step is stitching this onto the bottom here, flipping it up. That covers all of this, and it looks like I need a wider tab, but this origami happens, and then this is what clean finishes the bottom of your shirt front.